Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at He, Understanding Masculine Psychology by Robert A. Johnson. This is a pretty short book, even with the appendix and the bibliography comes in at under 90 pages. Short book. Published in 1974. This is a Jungian book. It's pretty good and interesting. It has a couple of, it has a foreword by an assistant in psychiatry, Ruth Tiffany Barnhouse. It has an introduction by John Sanford. I like when books do this. They've got like a few sections, maybe even an afterword or an appendix or some other thing by somebody else sharing their opinions about some of the topic that's written. That's kind of why I also like anthologies, collections of essays. You get a bunch of different people's opinions about usually some related topic. Even in that last book, the Man and His Symbols, and the essays were actually, some of them in a few limited points would refer back to earlier essays, would refer back to Jung's introduction, which I guess they had access to as they were writing the follow-up essays. And that's part of, I guess, the appeal of the podcast, right? Looking at a bunch of different authors and what they have to say about a range of topics. Anyway, this one is about masculine psychology, but it's almost mistitled. I would say that this is more an analysis of a particular myth. And it does look at masculine psychology, but it looks at human psychology also. And I think it's probably more applicable to everybody than the author might like to admit. It's not just, I don't think, applicable to men. I mean, maybe it is in some parts and to some extents. He does talk about women and their relationship with the Holy Grail, because that's what this book is about, the Holy Grail. Men and their relationship with the Holy Grail. That's the myth that's analyzed, the myth of the Holy, and specifically the myth of Parsifal, who was seeking after the Holy Grail. And it interprets this myth in a really interesting way, and in some parts very specific to the development of men. I guess most of it does continually point back to men. I mean, that's kind of the theme of the book, but I think it could probably be applied to women as well in some respects. And the other thing is that it misses a lot of masculinity. It hits on a few things, and it makes a lot out of a few things. And then there are some other things that gets mentioned here or there, but doesn't get made. Doesn't make a lot of it as being a major part of masculine psychology. And I don't think masculine psychology really can be boiled down to the search for a sort of psychological holy grail, as much as the author suggests. So he may be over applying his myth a little bit, or making claims to its applicability that might be a little exaggerated. So with all those criticisms out of the way, I should say that it's a fun and interesting book, and I really like this sort of psychological Jungian analysis of mythology. I think this stuff is so interesting. And he does walk through the myth for us. He doesn't expect us to be fluent in the myth of Parsifal. So I'm gonna walk through with him, step by step, as he describes the major portions of the myth of Parsifal. Skipping over a little bit that I think is less relevant, and hitting on the points that I think are most relevant. And like all my episodes, I'll be reading a few sections starting right here at the beginning of chapter 1, where he says, quote, "Often, when a new era begins in history, a myth for that era springs up at the same time. The myth is a sort of preview of what is to come. and it contains sage advice for coping with the psychological elements of the time. In the myth of Parsifal's search for the Holy Grail, we have such a spiritual prescription for our own time. The Grail myth arose in the 12th century. Many people feel that our modern age began about then, that the ideas, attitudes, and concepts we are living with today had their beginnings in the days when the Grail myth took form. The theme of the Grail myth was much in evidence in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. One hears echoes of it all over Europe. We will be using the French version, which is the earliest written account, taken from a poem by Chrétien de Troyes. There is also a German version by Wolfram von Eschenbach. The English version, Le Morte d'Arthur, comes from the 14th century. By that time, it had been elaborated a great deal. It is enormously complex and has been so editorialized that some of its spontaneous psychological truth has been lost. The French version is simpler, more direct, and nearer to the unconscious. Therefore, it is more helpful for our purposes. It is important to remember that a myth is a living thing and exists within every person. You will get the true living form of the myth if you can see it as it spins away inside yourself. The most rewarding thing you can do with this or any myth is to see how it is alive in your own psychological structure. The Grail myth speaks of masculine psychology. We must take everything that goes into the myth as part of man. We will have to cope with a dazzling array of fair damsels, but we must see these too as parts of the masculine psyche. But women also will be interested in the secrets of the Grail myth, for every woman has to cope with one of these exotic creatures, the male of the species, somehow or other, as father or husband or son. So I hope it will be helpful for you to observe the incredible carryings on of the mythological man, Parsifal, and his interior fair maidens. Our story begins with the Grail Castle. The Grail Castle is in trouble. The Fisher King, the king of the castle, has been wounded. His wounds are so severe that he cannot live, yet he is incapable of dying. He groans, he cries out, he suffers all the time. In fact, the whole land is in desolation. The cattle do not reproduce. The crops won't grow. Knights are killed. Children are orphaned. Maidens weep. There is mourning everywhere, all because the Fisher King is wounded. The notion that the welfare of a kingdom depends upon the virility or power of its ruler has been a common one, especially among primitive people. There are still kingdoms in the primitive parts of the world where the king is killed when he can no longer produce any offspring. He is simply killed, ceremonially, sometimes slowly, sometimes horribly, because it is thought that the kingdom will not prosper under a weak or ailing king. Now the Grail Castle is in serious trouble because the Fisher King is wounded. The myth tells us how this came about. Years before, early in his adolescence, when the Fisher King was wandering around in the woods, he came upon a camp. All the people of the camp were gone, but there on a spit roasting over the fire was a salmon. The boy naively took a bit of the salmon to eat, which is as natural as anything could be. He was hungry. There was the salmon roasting over the fire, and he took a bit of it. Well, he burned his fingers horribly and dropped the salmon. He put his fingers in his mouth to assuage the burn, and in so doing got a taste of the salmon in his mouth, but he was badly wounded. He was then named the Fisher King because he was wounded by a fish. End quote. Okay, so we got a lot there. He says he's using the earliest of the Parsifal myths because it's the simplest and the closest to the unconscious. And I do think that myths and stories have a portion that comes from the subconscious mind of the creator or creators or people who have influenced it. And these myths that pass on from writer to writer, they in a sense, there's a filtering out of the unnecessary or a filtering out of the things that one particular writer thought was important, but maybe don't stand the test of time of being passed on. And so it filters out everything but the archetypal components. But also, like the author says here, it can get embellished. If it becomes very popular, the author wants to make their mark on it. They add a little bit here and add a little bit there, and it becomes very involved. And apparently that's the English version is like that, so he uses the French version. He also says it's a myth for our time, which is weird. I mean, it's goes way back to the 12th century. When you talk about modernity, I tend to think it's a little bit more recent than the 12th century. Now, maybe bits and pieces of modernity could be traced back to the 12th century. I'm not myself, I don't think, quite so inclined to say that the myth for our particular 21st century era is Parsifal, but it's always good to have a look back at these prior myths and see what they can say to us in the present, because some of these things, of course, are timeless. So he talks about the Fisher King, and he talks about how the whole land is ill because the king is wounded, and that was mentioned as a sort of the introduction to the shadow in the last episode, the wounded king. And here we see some interesting thing that is going to come up time and time again. That I've mentioned also, in addition to the wounded king, I've mentioned the sort of song burst forth in the midst of tragedy. In Edith Hamilton's book, The Greek Way, I talked about that. And William James, of course, talked about the twice born finding religion or finding some saving light or some saving change in one's outlook in the midst of the darkest moments. And that's sort of being born a second time. Those are two things that I think are related. The wounded king and that. Because you have something where there's the king is of the highest order and yet is fatally wounded, and there is the source of all of the problem in the kingdom, and the out of the darkest night comes the lightest bit of brightness. They're sort of parallels or reversals of one another. Out of darkness, light, and out of light, darkness. There's an interesting dichotomy there between those two different things, and both of those concepts come up in mythology. And here he talks about how the Fisher King was wounded. It happened when he touched a salmon. He stumbled upon a camp in the woods, but nobody was there, but there was a salmon cooking over the fire. He grabbed it. It burned him. And so he's wounded by a fish, so he's the Fisher King. And the author, a little bit after the spot that I read, talks about how the fish is a symbol, the salmon is a symbol for Christ, and that there's a sort of Christ consciousness. Many psychic wounds in a man comes because he touches his Christ nature, that is his individuation process. I tend to think that Christianity is a poor fit for Jungian analysis myself, so I just like to think of it as the fish. And one thing I think is important is the salmon is the type of fish that it is. Specifically, it's not just a fish in the campsite, but it's a salmon in the campsite, which is a distinctly pink or red fish. So consider that. Keep that in mind as we read. As we jump forward to the next section, where he says, quote, "The myth now turns from the Fisher King and his wound to the story of a boy who doesn't have a name. He was born in Wales. In those days, to be born in Wales was to be born in the farthest possible outlands. It is a bit reminiscent of the commentary in the scriptures, what good could come out of Nazareth? Apparently Nazareth and Wales were both at the bottom of the list in the collective mind. So, of course, that is where the hero will come from. The hero, the saving quality, comes from the place where you least expect it. We are going to find out later that this boy's name is Parsifal, which means innocent fool. It is a humbling thing for a Fisher King to rely on his Parsifal nature for his salvation. It is a bit like the biblical injunction, except ye become as a little child, ye cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Unless you will trust your Parsifal nature for your redemption, there is no hope for you. This comes hard for a man, for his masculine pride bites the dust. Jung describes an occasion when he was forced to do this. the great falling out between Jung and Freud occurred over the nature of the unconscious. Freud said that the unconscious is a scrap heap consisting of all the unvalued things in one's life that have been repressed to the unconscious. Jung insisted that the unconscious is also the matrix, the artisan well, from which all creativity springs. Freud would have none of this, so the two of them broke. This was a frightening thing for Jung to go through. He was young, untried, with no reputation of his own. It looked as if he were finishing a career almost before it began. But Jung said that he went home and decided that if he really believed that the unconscious was the fountain from which all creativity sprang, he would have to trust it. So he locked himself up in his room and waited on the unconscious. It wasn't long before he was down on the floor with his childish games. This led him to recall his childhood fantasies, which he then decided to express in a form of adult play. For months, he labored in his backyard, building out of stone the villages and towns and forts he had fantasized as a boy. He trusted his childlike experience, and that was the beginning for him of an outpouring from the collective unconscious, from which we have the legacy of Jungian psychology. That was Parsifal at work. Parsifal, we will call him that, though he doesn't get a name until much later in the myth, is raised by his mother, whose name is Heart Sorrow. His father is gone, and he knows nothing about him, nor does he have any brothers or sisters. He grows up in primitive circumstances, wears homespun clothes, has no schooling, and is completely untutored. He asks no questions and is just simply a naive youth. Early in his adolescence, he was out playing one day when 5 knights came riding by on horseback. Parsifal had never seen a knight before. The scarlet and gold trappings, the armor, the shields, the lances, all the accoutrements of the knights dazzle poor Parsifal so completely that he dashes home to tell his mother that he has seen 5 gods. He is on fire from what he has seen and decides to leave immediately to join the 5 magnificent kings. He hadn't known that such a thing existed. His mother burst into tears. She tries to talk him out of it, but wise mother that she is, soon sees that there is no hope, that the boy will go off with the knights. So she tells Parsifal that his father had been a knight and had been killed rescuing a fair maiden. Parsifal's 2 brothers had also been killed as knights. Parsifal's mother had taken him to a remote place and kept this story from him in hopes that he might not go off to a similar fate. But now it has happened. There is no hope. So she tells him all of this, gives him her blessing, and gives him some instructions. These instructions will reverberate through the whole myth, so it is of worth listening to them. First, she tells him to respect all fair damsels. Second, he is to go to church daily. Whenever he needs food, he will find it in church. Then she instructs him not to ask any questions. Usually pretty good advice to a garrulous boy. But later in the myth we find that this last bit of advice is disastrous. End quote. So we switch from the Fisher King now to young Parsifal, who does not yet have a name, but apparently it means innocent fool, and at some point he's given that name. And so partly because we can say maybe because of the name, and because much of the meat of the myth has to do, not all, but a good portion of the interesting parts of the myth have to do with his early days as a knight, when he first became interested in knighthood. And we see a little bit of his childhood here with his mother, single mom, wants to protect him from the world, and his family, his father and his brothers have all been killed. They were knights. She's trying to protect him from getting killed like the rest of his family, but she can't. So he sees the knights and he goes off to become one. Unsurprisingly. And he does talk a little bit about how the hero arises from the most dismal outlands, Tatooine, the Wales, the distant outskirts of civilization, from a poor family. Anyhow, let's jump forward to the Red Knight. This is the next interesting section here. He says, quote, "Now Parsifal continues on his way and is met by a Red Knight, who has just come from King Arthur's court. The Red Knight is so strong that Arthur's court was powerless before him. He simply walked in, took anything he wanted, and did anything he wanted to do. He has in his hands a silver cup, the chalice that he stole from the court. Parsifal is dazzled by the Red Knight. He has red armor. He has a scarlet tunic. The horse's trappings and saddle and all the knightly equipment are scarlet. He cuts a magnificent figure. Parsifal stops the Red Knight and asks him how he too can get to be a knight. The Red Knight is so perplexed by the naive young fool in front of him that he doesn't harm him but tells Parsifal that if he wants to be a knight he should go to Arthur's court. Then he laughs and goes on. So Parsifal finds his way to King Arthur's court. He tells the first page he meets at the court that he wants to be knighted and asks how this is done. He is laughed at, of course. The process of becoming a knight is an arduous one, but Parsifal naively asks and asks and asks, until finally he is brought to King Arthur himself. Arthur, a kindly man, doesn't scorn Parsifal, but tells him he must learn a great deal and be versed in all the knightly arts, and Parsifal understands. Now, there is in Arthur's court a damsel, who, because of some difficulty that had happened, has not smiled or laughed for 6 years. The legend in the court is that when the best knight in the world comes along, the damsel, who has not smiled for 6 years, will burst into smiles and laughter. The instant this damsel sees Parsifal, she bursts into laughter. The court is mightily impressed with this. Apparently, the best knight in the world has appeared. Here is this naive youth, the boy in homespun garments, completely untutored, and the maiden is laughing. Extraordinary. We know that until the Parsifal part of a person's nature appears, there is a feminine part of him that has never smiled, that is incapable of being happy, and that she comes to life with a glow when Parsifal appears. If one can wake the Parsifal in a man, another part of him immediately becomes happy. I had an experience of this recently. A man came to my house and he was crying. Life was just impossible for him. It was not really possible to talk with him, so I told him stories and had him take part in the story. I made him play Parsifal. I made him enter into this childlike journey, and presently he was laughing. The maiden, who hadn't laughed for 6 years, burst out in joy in him. Then he had some energy to go on. The awakening of Parsifal in a man sets all manner of living things going in him. King Arthur takes all this about the maiden laughing very seriously, and knights Parsifal on the spot. One of the chamberlains in the court is angry at this, and pushes Parsifal into the fireplace, humiliating but not injuring him, and slaps the damsel, who had regained her ability to laugh. Parsifal is furious, and vows to revenge the insulted maiden. Then he goes to Arthur and says, "I have a request. I want a horse, and I want the armor of the Red Knight." Everyone laughs uproariously because there had not been a knight in King Arthur's court who had been strong enough to stand up to the Red Knight. Arthur laughs too and says, "You have my permission. You may have the horse and armor of the Red Knight if you can get it." Parsifal sets forth. He finds the Red Knight and says that Arthur has given him permission to take his horse and armor. The Red Knight guffaws and says, "Fine, if you can get it." Parsifal has acquired a page by this time, and the page produces a sword for him. I have never been able to find out where this sword comes from. I am very curious. I would like to know very much where Parsifal's first sword comes from, but I find no reference. He just has a sword. Maybe it is a natural sword that a boy has natively by inheritance. So they have a duel, and wonder of wonders, Parsifal kills the Red Knight. He pierces him through the eye. In the French version, this is the only killing in the myth. Parsifal undoes dozens of knights in the rest of the myth, but he kills only the Red Knight. The victory over the Red Knight may be accomplished either inwardly, outwardly, or in both dimensions. In any case, the Red Knight represents that strong, virile, masculine stuff a boy needs so desperately. If the Red Knight is slain outwardly, then the boy gets the masculine virility by overcoming some great obstacle. He defeats or overcomes an adversary in his path in a contest that requires from him courage and risk, and in this way he takes on the power of the Red Knight for himself. Generally, such a victory consists in winning something, or coming in first in the face of opposition. It may be accomplished by making the football team, or being the best at something, going on an arduous trip such as hiking in the mountains or defying someone. Unfortunately, a boy generally gets his red knight armor by taking it from someone else. That is the fierce competitiveness of adolescence and masculinity in general. Almost every boy has to win from somebody else. His winning isn't any good unless somebody else loses, which means that he has to lose sometimes too, but somewhere he's got to get this red knight armor. He's got to win, to be top man. Boys will struggle fiercely for this. It is a matter of life and death for them. End quote. So I want to point out something here, and that's the repetition of the color red in the Red Knight, and the red of the salmon that burned him, the red, of course, of the fire that burned not him but the Fisher King. And actually, let me point out that I think there's a strange blurring that occurs here, and the author goes along with this blurring a little in that the very first chapter doesn't introduce Parsifal. The first chapter introduces the Fisher King, and he's kind of setting the stage for the scenario here of the quest for the Holy Grail and the Fisher King and the stuff that makes up the story. But he doesn't open up with Parsifal and tell the story from start to finish and introduce the Fisher King at the appropriate point in Parsifal's story. He introduces the Fisher King first and points out his woundedness right off the bat, and how the Fisher King is a wounded king, and the darkness is across the land, and there's a problem that must be solved here in the Fisher King. And I think that in a sense, if you think about it, the story of the Fisher King is like the story of Parsifal in a way that Parsifal repeats the story of the Fisher King in some sense. I think also the repetition of elements make them become more apparent to the unconscious mind as you hear the myth and perceive the myth. You can think back to the episode on the book Thinking Fast and Slow, and the way words and concepts can get introduced, and we respond to them with our fast-thinking mind to words and signals and concepts at a subconscious level. We change our behavior because of things like that. The words hit us at that sort of subconscious level and affect us. And so when things are repeated in that way, we become more tuned in to concepts. Even though our conscious mind may not notice the repetition of the color red in the salmon and the Red Knight, subconsciously we might pick up on that. But remember, he's been given a piece of bad advice, right, from his mom. He started out, Parsifal starts out in this real, backwoods part of Wales, single mom, and he sets out to become a knight. And she says, remember this advice, and she gives him bad advice. And he takes it with him. He takes this bad advice with him. She doesn't mean any harm. She's not trying to harm him. But her concern for his safety prompts her to tell him, don't ask any questions. Don't stand out. Don't do anything that's going to make somebody, draw attention to yourself in a bad way that might cost you to lose your life, like Parsifal's father and brothers. So she tries to protect him, but she gives him bad advice. So he sets out into the world to become a knight, carrying with him a wound in a way. He's not prepared correctly to become a knight. He's missing something, right? First of all, he doesn't have a father figure, so he's wounded in that way. And that's probably related to the wound that he carries with him in the form of his mother's bad advice. And in a way, for him to become a knight, right, he has to overcome the Red Knight. He has to do battle with the Red Knight and defeat the Red Knight to take his place as a knight. I wonder to what extent he has to overcome his bad advice. He has to overcome his own wound. I don't know. He certainly has to overcome the Red Knight because it's like points out the obvious competitive nature of adolescence and of masculinity, and that Parsifal has to win something. He has to cross some threshold to say, like, I'm the best now, right? I have earned my position at the round table. You can't just get let into the round table. You have to, and not everybody can sit at the round table, right? I mean, there's competition, which means somebody wins and somebody loses, and only the winners get to sit at the round table. And that's the way of life. And it's a different sort of shade of red too. The salmon is more of like a pink fish, and the red knight is more the color of blood and gore, which is possibly also relevant. Anyway, let me move forward from there to the next section where he says, quote, "There is also an inner dimension to the Red Knight struggle. For a boy to become a man, he must master his own aggression. He cannot be a man without knowing how to be aggressive, but it must be controlled aggression that is at his conscious disposal. If he is just overcome by his rage and violence, then it is no good. His masculinity is not yet formed. Psychologically, he has been defeated inwardly by his Red Knight. His ego lies prostrate, and the Red Knight in him has won, emerging as a terrible bully, a violent temper, or even in vandalism or criminal ways. So every boy on his way to manhood has to learn how to master this violent side of himself and integrate that terrible masculine power for aggression into his conscious personality. Looked at in this way, the Red Knight is the shadow side of masculinity, the negative, potentially destructive side. To become truly a man, the shadow personality must be struggled with, but it cannot be repressed. The boy cannot repress his aggressiveness and win that way, for he needs exactly that masculine power, which is to be found in his Red Knight shadow. It is a matter of his ego becoming strong enough so that he cannot be overcome by his rage, but can use the power in it for conscious purposes. That is, to overcome obstacles in his path and achieve his goals. Obviously, the outer battle and the inner battle are part of the struggle. To win against the outer opponent and come out top dog, a boy must be able to muster and direct his masculine energies, and also must put aside his cowardice and longing to be protected by mother from danger. So he cannot win against the Red Knight adversary outside of himself without winning his inner struggle too. At the same time, not many boys will win the struggle just on the inside. That encounter with the outer obstacles, which challenges his will and identity, is also needed to really firm up his masculinity on the inside. There is an interesting detail at this moment. When Parsifal is about to put on the Red Knight's armor, his page says, "Take off that awful homespun stuff your mother gave you before you put the armor on." But Parsifal refuses and puts the Red Knight armor over his mother's homespun garment. In other words, he puts on his new masculinity over his mother complex. Of course, everything goes wrong immediately. This is par for the course for a young man. He takes his newfound strength, his swashbuckling masculinity that he has just discovered at about 15 or 16 years of age, and puts it on over his mother complex. That's a laughable combination. Of course, it doesn't work. So Parsifal gets on the Red Knight's horse, and off he goes. There is a wonderful detail in one version of the story that Parsifal rides all day because he doesn't know how to stop the horse. Somehow by nightfall, or from exhaustion, we don't know from what, the horse stops. Parsifal has managed his first day on the horse. If any man is sufficiently honest with himself, he will remember the first time he got astride the Red Knight's horse and couldn't stop it. Then Parsifal goes to Gornemond's castle. Gornemond is Parsifal's godfather, so to speak. He trains him, takes some of the rough edges off. Among other things, Gornemond got his mother's homespun out from underneath the Red Knight's armor, and teaches him the things a boy needs to know for the pursuit of chivalry. He urges Parsifal to stay with him for another year to study, but Parsifal refuses, and goes off quite suddenly because he thinks his mother might be in trouble. Gornemond has taught Parsifal two specific things, and much of the myth revolves around these two instructions. The first is that if Parsifal is to search for the Holy Grail, the only proper pursuit for a knight, one primary requirement lies upon him. He must never seduce or be seduced by a woman. There must be no physical intimacy with a woman, or there is no hope for the Grail. The second instruction is that when Parsifal gets into the Grail castle, he must ask the specific question, whom does the Grail serve? This is a curious question, which we do not understand for quite a while, but these two instructions are drummed into Parsifal's head by Gornemond. So off he goes to hunt for his mother. He finds that soon after he left his mother, she died of a broken heart. You remember that her name was Heart Sorrow. Naturally, Parsifal feels dreadfully guilty about this, but this also is part of his masculine development. No son ever develops into manhood without being disloyal to his mother in some way. If he remains with his mother to comfort her and console her, then he never gets out of his mother complex. Often, a mother will do all she can to keep her son with her. One of the most subtle ways is to encourage him in the idea of being loyal to mother. But if he gives in to her completely on this score, then she often winds up with a son who has a severely injured masculinity. The son must ride off and leave his mother, even if it seems to mean disloyalty, and the mother must bear this pain. Later, like Parsifal, the son may then come back to the mother, and they may find a new relationship on a new level, but this can only be done after the son has first achieved his independence and transferred his affections to a woman of his own age. In our myth, Parsifal's mother had died when he returned. Perhaps she represents the kind of woman who can only exist as a mother, who psychologically dies when this role is taken from her, because she does not understand how to be an individual woman, only a mother. End quote. So, couple important things there. The first is that there's a portion of the battle with the Red Knight that is external, right? Becoming the top dog, winning the competition, achieving your masculine power, which requires an external struggle. And then there's also an internal struggle, an inner dimension to the Red Knight struggle, where the boy masters his own aggression. In order to become a man, he has to have self-control. And so that's interesting. But yeah, I mean, basically, like he needs the armor. He needs the armor and he needs the horse in order to become a knight. You can't not have those things. And in order to get them, he has to defeat the Red Knight. They're not just sitting around waiting for him to just pick up somewhere. He has to win the competition and defeat the Red Knight in order to get the necessary tools to be a knight. So there's the inner and the external portion of it, and that's kind of cool how in the myth he doesn't just defeat the Red Knight, but he defeats the Red Knight and takes this stuff from him to become a knight. At any rate, he puts the knight's armor over the homespun garments of his mother, so he's still got his mother complex. And then he goes on to Gornemond's house. And Gornemond finally gets the homespun garments off of Parsifal, so he helps him get rid of his mother complex, his mother attachment. And this is sort of the necessary masculine father figure. And would Parsifal's story be able to continue correctly if there was no Gornemond figure? He finds out from Gornemond, well, first of all, he gets rid of the mother complex by having a father figure. He learns what the proper pursuit for a knight is, the search for the Holy Grail, and he learns that he needs to not seduce or be seduced by a woman. There's no physical intimacy with a woman, or there's no hope for the Grail. And this is an odd requirement, but that I never have quite understood. All of all of the knights have ladies, and presumably they're not like sleeping with these ladies, but at some point don't they get married and have families, right? I mean, Parsifal's father was a knight, and Parsifal has a mother, so Parsifal's father clearly slept with Parsifal's mother. So I think like knights can have wives, but they have to stop searching for the Grail at that point, or do they just have to retain their virtue and not seduce women outside of marriage, or what? What's the whole like celibacy thing all about? I guess as somebody who's really interested in evolutionary theory, it seems incredibly counterproductive to valorize failure to procreate. But I don't know. perhaps there's some part of Parsifal that some part of innocence of Parsifal that is lost when he's no longer a virgin. So his pursuit of the Holy Grail is a pursuit that he has to undertake from a position of innocence, and guilty, being outside the domain of innocence and naivety. The Holy Grail is no longer available to him. Perhaps it's implying something like along those lines. But the second instruction that he gets that's so important is he has to ask, whom does the Grail serve? Which is an interesting question. And that comes up later. But we see that his mother has died while he was away. And that's just the way of the world, I guess. She was not able to accept his life as a knight. She wanted something from him that he wasn't able to give and should not have been required to. I mean, it's his destiny. It's Parsifal's destiny to become a knight. It's not his destiny to stay home with his mom. So what she was asking of him was wounding him, damaging him, more so than protecting or helping him. The author talks about how mothers will tend to do all that they can to keep their sons with them. There's a point at which there's too much mother, right? I mean, that's why the father figure was so important. Mother unchained is too much and goes from being helpful to being harmful. So anyway, let me move forward. There are various things that happen with Parsifal along the way, but then we come to this interesting portion here where he says, quote, Parsifal is far out in the woods. He passes by somebody who says there is no habitation within 30 miles. But just at dusk he comes across two men in a boat. One is fishing, the other rowing. The fisherman invites him to come and stay with him for the night. He gives Parsifal directions to his house and goes on. Parsifal follows the instructions and finds himself at a moat with a drawbridge over it. He scarcely has ridden over the drawbridge when it is pulled up, actually striking the back feet of his horse as it snaps closed. Parsifal finds himself in a great castle. As he goes into the courtyard, 4 youths come out, take his horse, take off his clothes, bathe him, and dress him in beautiful scarlet clothing. Then 2 youths lead him to the fisherman he has seen, who is, of course, the Fisher King. The Fisher King apologizes because he is wounded and therefore unable to rise and greet Parsifal properly. But the whole court is there, 400 knights and their ladies. There is a fireplace in the center of the great hall that faces in each of the 4 cardinal directions. One learns that in symbolism, when the number 4 appears, it signifies the presence of completeness or totality. This is the Grail Castle. If we hadn't known it any other way, we could tell by the many symbols of totality that turn up. The 4 youths, the 400 knights and ladies, the 4 faces of the fire. So the Fisher King, groaning in agony, welcomes Parsifal. There is some ceremony, and then a procession comes in. A youth carries a sword that drips blood constantly. Then a maiden comes bearing the chalice, the Holy Grail itself. Another maiden comes bearing the paten that was used at the Last Supper. There are many more things in the procession, but these are the ones with which we are mainly concerned. A great banquet is held. The Fisher King presides from his couch. He can't even sit up. As the Grail is passed about without a word, it gives each guest whatever food he silently wishes for. He has only to wish, and the Grail produces the food or drink. A silver tray does likewise. As the evening goes on, Parsifal is dazzled by what is happening. The Fisher King's niece brings a sword and gives it to the Fisher King, who straps it onto Parsifal's waist. It becomes Parsifal's sword. Parsifal is speechless at this gift. You can imagine this country boy in a castle with all this ceremony going on, especially the magic of the Grail. Parsifal says not a word. Remember, Gornemond told him that when the true knight comes to the Grail Castle, if he is lucky enough to find it, he must ask the great question, whom does the Grail serve? But Parsifal is remembering the advice of his mother, don't ask questions. So he keeps absolutely still. He is just amazed at everything that is going on. he relapses into complete naivety and simply observes. The evening wears on. The Fisher King is carried in his litter to his own room, and all the guests and knights depart. 2 youths take Parsifal to his quarters, undress him, and put him to bed. In the morning, when Parsifal wakes, there is not a soul to be seen. He knocks on several doors, but there is no response. He goes down into the courtyard. His horse is saddled and ready. He calls. Empty echoes. No one is about. He gets on his horse and goes over the drawbridge. Again, the drawbridge snaps closed, striking the back feet of the horse. Then the Grail castle disappears. There is nothing but forest. End quote. So there we have the interesting visit to the Grail castle. And again, we find he's like, now it's Parsifal who's in the middle of nowhere, and there's nothing there. There's not a soul in sight. And lo and behold, there's the humble fisherman fishing on the river with somebody else rowing. And lo and behold, this is the great Fisher King who has the Holy Grail. So again, we see this greatness out of this incredibly humble, desolate, dark beginnings. He's looking for a place to sleep. There's no habitation. There's no inn. There's nowhere he can rest his head. He sees the fisherman on the boat who directs him to his house, and then there we go from there. So that's, again, a repetition of this motif of the highest power coming from nothing, coming from the darkest environment. We also see the use of the number 4 with the 4 faces of the fireplace. I guess it's one big fireplace in the center of the hall with a outward-facing fireplace giving off heat in 4 directions, the 4 directions of the cardinal points. So it sounds sort of like a circular hall to me. I don't know, maybe that's not true. I'm not sure if he said specifically that it was a circular hall, but it's a hall with 4 cardinal points, 400 people. Well, there's a courtyard, so I don't know. I guess it's sort of traditional castle shape. Anyway, there's the number 4 repeated here. 4 youths come out. The other thing that's repeated that he doesn't make a lot about, but you notice that it's all young people, youths, maidens. I guess there's 400. Well, there's 400 knights and their maidens, so I guess those aren't exactly youths. 400 knights and ladies. But there's a sort of like a real youthful, vital thing going on here, where I guess the Fisher King really seems like the only old person here. I guess would be what I the vibe I get. Maybe the Fisher King is not old, but we get the vibe that he's decrepit, right? But I guess maybe he's still young. But he failed to ask the necessary question. He kept his mouth shut on his mother's advice rather than asking the question, whom does the Grail serve, on Gorneman's advice? And might this have been a bit of cowardice? Maybe he doesn't want to hear the answer. And it's an odd question. It's almost like you expect that the answer is going to be one of 2 things. Either God/Christ or Satan, right? It's either ultimate good, the Grail serves ultimate good, or the Grail serves ultimate evil. You kind of get the impression, I get the impression, that those are probably the only 2 answers that one is really going to get from this question. That was my first impression of it anyway. And maybe like he's sitting here at this feast with all these great people and all this great food, and he doesn't really want to ask because he doesn't really want to hear the answer. And he's afraid that he's going to find himself in a real pickle if he asks the question and doesn't hear the answer that he wants to hear. But as long as he doesn't ask the question, he can always sort of plead ignorance. That seems like it might be a motivating reason why he keeps his mouth shut. But that's the sort of cowardly approach, isn't it? And ultimately, like the manly thing to do is to ask the question, like, who's in charge around here? Like, what is going on? Am I in a place of God, or am I in a place of the devil? That's the manly thing to do, is to ask the question, to get your bearings and know the circumstances. And it's a sort of cowardly, effeminate thing to not ask the question and plead ignorance as a sort of excuse for not acting. And he fails. So he fails in this regard, right? He doesn't ask the question. And it's because he's carrying with him, just like the Fisher King is wounded, he's got his own wound that causes him to be unable to ask the correct question. And now there's 400 knights at the place, and I don't know how they got there, whether they asked the right question. I don't know who any of the other people are in the Fisher Kingdom, but they seem like they're all sort of magical. Maybe they all asked the right question and were able to join the court of the... I don't know. I don't know about that, but he does seem to sort of bring a wound of his own into the Grail Castle, and that is his mother complex, his dedication to his mother, his willingness to have his manliness be constrained by the fears of his own mother. So that I think is an interesting thing that stands out to me. So continuing from there, after he leaves the castle and finds that it has disappeared, the author says, quote, "Let's pause and see where we are. The Grail Castle is the place of the most precious feminine quality, and the Grail is the epitome of all that is feminine. It is the highest feminine symbol, the Holy of Holies in its feminine expression. It is that for which the knight searches all his life. It gives a man everything that he asks, even before he asks it. It is perfect happiness, the ecstatic experience. The thing that is most touching about this part of the myth is that it is telling us that a youth can blunder into the Grail Castle sometime in his mid-adolescence without earning it or even asking for it. Perhaps every boy in his adolescence spends at least one day in the Grail Castle and experiences this perfection. The first 2 sentences in a book I received today read, "All of us, at some moment, have had a vision of our existence as unique, untransferable, and very precious. This transformation almost always takes place during adolescence." There it is. Usually a man has repressed this, but if he will remember back, somewhere there was a moment when he stumbled into the Grail Castle. This usually happens around 15 or 16 years of age. There is that morning or that perfect day. One wakes up in the middle of the night and goes out and walks in the moonlight. It is not a love affair at this time, but it is often closely associated with the first falling in love. It is a solitary experience. It may happen among others, but basically it is a solitary experience. I remember a boy who told me that he woke up one summer morning when he was 15, climbed out the window, and went out to watch the sunrise. Then he climbed back in the window again, woke up, and came down to breakfast as though nothing had happened. But he had been in the Grail Castle for that couple of hours in the early dawn. Some people are wise enough, courageous enough, or honest enough to record these events. Poets speak of such mornings early in life when they discover beauty, ecstasy, the golden world. The Grail Castle doesn't exist physically. It is an inner reality, an experience of the soul. I think it is probably best described as a level of consciousness. A boy wakes up with something new in him, a power, a perception, a strength, a vision. This is his Grail Castle. He can't describe it or hang on to it, but he will never be the same again. People often tease an adolescent out of his Grail Castle experience, but one should never do this. It is a holy thing for him. Nothing will ever happen to him that is more beautiful or more important or more formative for him. For when he is out of the Grail Castle, he is miserable. He can think of nothing else. Nothing else will do once he has seen the Grail Castle. Even if he represses the memory of the Grail Castle from his consciousness, his longing for it will eat away at him from the unconscious. There is an old proverb from the Middle Ages that a person has a chance at the splendor of God, at the golden world, twice in his life, once early in adolescence, and again when he is 45 or 50. Parsifal will come back to the Grail Castle years later and ask the right question. This time, he only blundered into it, and he can't cope with it. No boy can cope with the Grail experience when it first comes to him. He can't stand it, but he does see it. He is touched, almost fatally, by it. It sometimes destroys him. More often than not, it fires him up to a wild, compulsive kind of search. It is the motivation, conscious or unconscious, for a great deal of the rest of his life. For in the Grail Castle, he has known perfect happiness. He has known that utter, absolute contentment and beauty and joy that the Grail Castle can give him. Then, when he loses it all, he becomes a Grail searcher, an urgent, questing beast fairly pawing the earth to find again the beauty he viewed so briefly. His spiritual hunger forces him to climb everything that is climbable, to try this, to try that, in a restless search for the lost Grail Castle. The Grail gives complete satisfaction and wholeness. If you have ever had that, how can you live an ordinary life? Parsifal could not stay in the Grail Castle because he failed to ask the question Gornemond had told him to ask. He remained silent because he followed his mother's advice and not Gornemond's. His mother complex cost him the ability to stay in the Grail Castle. A man's mother complex does not allow him to stay in the Grail Castle the first time around. After a man is out of his mother's grip, as soon as he will ask the question in the Grail Castle, then he can live in it. If the Grail Castle experience is very strong for a boy, it nearly incapacitates him. The youths who wander around seemingly without any motive or idea where they are going are sometimes young men who have been half blinded by their Grail Castle experience. End quote. So here he's just sort of analyzing this Grail Castle as a psychological concept, and he says it's something that people experience, that boys experience in their adolescence, and it's a sort of vision of perfection, the perfect dream of the perfect love from the perfect woman. You know, when you get one-itis when you're a teenager, sometimes it's related to that, or it's wrapped up in that similar sort of feeling. I mean, I feel like I remember when I was a teenager feeling very, I felt very spiritual for a little while, or felt like I was tuned into some kind of vibe that was spiritual in a way, or was special for me or something. A glimpse of a beautiful frame of mind, to almost see, like, if I could just grasp hold of this particular mindset all the time, if I could see like this all the time, see through these eyes every day, I could see everything. I could see the world in so much depth that the world would be beautiful all the time, and I would be empowered by this as well. I would be my best self, right? My best version of myself. One has to wonder how much the sort of great man concept that we saw in the previous episode could be somehow related or similar to the Grail or to the myth. Maybe the vision of Parsifal as a complete knight once he reaches his maturity. But I think that is a thing. It was for me sort of a magical feeling of adolescence. It's something you were experiencing, something that you would remember your whole life. The friends that you made, the things that you did, the places you were at, the experiences that you had in your adolescence. They can be very powerful, but I don't know, as though, like, he describes it as the ultimate feminine experience, and there is something sort of feminine about it's like, I don't know, like he talks about some kid going out and watching the sunrise, or it's like a passive. It's not like an prototypically active masculine experience. It's like a passive vision of beauty. And so I think it's fundamentally more feminine. I don't know if it's the ultimate feminine experience. Maybe it's a young boy sort of seeing aspects of the inner anima in that sense. But this is the point where I would say that he might consider how important this quest for the Holy Grail castle that one experienced in one's adolescence really drives masculine behavior. Probably partly. We have a part of Parsifal in us, but we are not Parsifal himself, right? We're not. He doesn't express the ultimate entirety of ourselves. He's an archetype, and he represents a part of us. Anyway, let me jump to the next section, where he says, quote, "Grail hunger accounts for all kinds of things. It's terrifying to approach this hunger in ourselves. If a man is courageous enough, he will understand the hunger I am talking about. It is a hunger that has to be filled. He's got to have something. He's not sure what. It is the Saturday evening restlessness of a youth. He has to have something or he will explode. Much advertising plays upon this hunger in a man. I am not sure how conscious advertising people are about it, but they know how to play on this. You can sell a man almost anything if you indirectly call it the Grail. This is also part of the reason, at least for the incredible hunger of people today for drugs. That is a magical way of getting back to the Grail ecstasy. Drugs will take you to an ecstatic experience, but I think this is the wrong way. The right way doesn't necessarily take a long time, but it is a long way. There are no shortcuts. The Grail experience is dangerous. As we said, too much of it, or the experience of it, at the wrong time is an invitation to a psychotic experience. The drawbridge can click shut too soon, and one is trapped and cannot get out. It is terrible to observe, but it is true of almost any man, that if he thinks something will fill that Grail quest in him, no cost is too high. If he were to die the next morning, he still would do it, if it promised to fill that Grail hunger. It is an irrational thing that knows almost no bounds. Much of the motivation of late adolescence, the daring do, the 90 miles an hour down the highway, or drugs even if it wrecks him, is the unconscious hungering for the Grail. A boy almost misconstrues this eruption of his feeling life. He translates it into a mood, which is partly a protective device, but it only makes trouble. He has to solve the mood problem before he can get on with the quest. Many boys are immobilized by the mood life and never change. The whole Grail quest gets sidetracked into a mood experience. The boy eventually becomes only a crotchety old man. It is almost a universal consensus among philosophers and poets in the Western world that life is tragic. Tragedy is a good term for what we are observing. Man, in his Grail quest, is the tragic man. The word tragedy has come to mean the quest for what one cannot attain or have. That is Western man, and that applies to the Grail castle. In the middle part of life, we are hungry for something that we cannot have. This is the tragic dimension of life. If a man is really honest, and you come up to him and ask him how he is, he may say, as one man very honestly said to me once, "Well, Robert, I am turning the crank." Middle age is the time in between the two Grail castle visits. He is proceeding. He is doing his duty. He is getting the mortgage paid off, getting the kids through school, and keeping his job going. But he is not satisfied, for deep within himself is the hunger for the Grail castle. End quote. So there's more about like how men spend their whole lives chasing after the Grail of their youth, and they will engage in all sorts of self-destructive behavior if they think that what they're doing is going to somehow fill that need, somehow provide that feeling that they had when they were in their adolescence, that feeling from their youth. That moment, the collection of moments, whatever it is, they're chasing after something that they think is going to fit. But he also says that between these two Grail visits, that there's a Grail visit in your adolescence and there's another one in your late 40s, which really seems like middle age to me, but late 40s, 50, early 50s, a second chance to visit the Grail castle. And in between that time, man is just going to work, paying off the mortgage, paying the bills, making sure that everything functions correctly. But he's all through that whole time, he's missing something, and he knows that he's hungering for something that is unfulfilled by any of the day-to-day affairs of normie life. And here, just the last section that I wanted to read, pretty straightforward. He says, quote, "Theoretically, a man may visit the Grail castle at any time. He doesn't necessarily come to it just twice. There are moments all along in a man's life when he gets a little bit of the Grail quality. This keeps him going. If a person were to make a list of the things, places, or circumstances that have brought this quality to him, it would be a revelation. Almost always they are small things. That morning when the toast tasted so good out of the toaster, or that Saturday when he turned the corner, the clouds had a special pattern, or the day someone paid him a bit of a compliment just in passing. It is almost never the big, dramatic thing, but the little thing that for just a moment puts him in touch again with the Grail. The drawbridge is a hint about the nature of the Grail castle. It doesn't exist in physical reality. It is an inner reality, a vision. It is poetry, a mystical experience. It is not a specific place. One must know and understand this if he is Grail questing. One of the first things that goes wrong with the quest is that he expects to find the happiness of the Grail experience with an outer something or in some place. This never works because the Grail isn't a place. How many men have made how many pilgrimages to particular spots where Grail castles burst open to them in their youth? How many men go back to the place where they grew up, thinking that the place has something to do with their Grail experience? The Grail castle is an experience that comes at a certain level of consciousness. It is poetic imagery, mystical vision. It does not exist in what is commonly called reality. End quote. So I like that a man can go to the Grail castle at any time. And various bits and pieces of moments, small moments, little moments. I can remember one moment when I was in college drinking, I think it was orange juice. I think I had a little bottle of orange juice that one gets at the corner store. And I'm waiting for a bus. And I'm drinking the orange juice. And the sun is shining. And I throw my head back to finish off my orange juice. And you know when the sun is shining through your eyelids, and like your whole field of vision is lit up even though your eyes are closed. And just like that moment just felt oddly amazing. I don't really know why, but it sticks with me. And bits and pieces of moments, sometimes when I'm driving by a particularly interesting looking swamp, I think to myself, that's just a sliver of beauty right there. I feel like I'm in touch with something primal, just looking at the way the gnarly old dead trees are. The experiences, a lot of times it has to do with nature. For me, it has to do with experiences in nature. Not always. Sometimes it's a moment with a friend. Seeing somebody that you're fond of in a certain light. Just little moments where he says it's almost like a glimpse of the Grail. And what is that Grail? It's like a sort of transcendent happiness, right? It's an experience of something that feels, how do you describe it? It feels transcendently satisfying. It feels like when you're experiencing it that it's more satisfying just existing in that moment than many other things that you might work hard to achieve. In that moment, it's almost like, wow, this is the moment we've all been waiting for. So apparently you can go back at any moment if you can get yourself into the right state of mind. You don't necessarily have to go back to that old tree that you used to climb where you had so many great experiences with your friends or things that you were thinking about when you were young and you were figuring out life. So I know I've got those memories of those times when I was an adolescent trying to figure out what life was really all about, how I should feel about different people and different things, and whether I should be a religious person or not, what sorts of things I should value, what sort of person I should be, how to get from who I am to who I would like to be. Moments like this that kind of stick with you and take on a magical quality. And sometimes you think you can go back to that spot. And sometimes the spot itself does rekindle those sorts of feelings. I wouldn't say that doesn't happen, but it's ultimately a mindset. And your objective is to rekindle the mindset periodically throughout your life from time to time, because that sort of keeps you going, waiting for the next moment when you will really feel that the presence of the Grail castle. And so that's our personal Holy Grail quest that we're on. We want to be able to not just glimpse it, but I guess we want to be able to enter the castle and ask the question and stay there and become one of the 400 knights who lives in that spot, who has that frame of mind as his default state of mind. Maybe that's what we're really after, to be able to live there in that spot all the time. So, thanks a lot for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.